Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jury by stating your full name and spelling your name?
My name is Saleem, S-A-M-A-N. Last name is S-A-L-E-E-M.
And could you please tell us your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree from Boston College in biochemistry and a master's of science in forensic science from Boston University.
And what is your occupation, ma'am?
I currently work as a forensic scientist 3 at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab within the DNA unit.
And what is a forensic scientist 3?
A forensic scientist 3 is a supervisory position within the DNA unit where I manage other analysts, forensic scientist 1 and 2, that work within the DNA unit.
So how many people do you supervise?
I supervise 6 people currently.
And what are your responsibilities in supervising those people?
As a supervisor, I manage their caseload by assigning them cases to work on in the laboratory, as well as for interpretation of DNA profiles for evidence items that are submitted to the DNA unit. I also train them in the methodologies for DNA testing. For example, if there's any new hires in our laboratory, I would be part of their training program where I would teach them about the laboratory work that's conducted, as well as give them presentations on the theoretical background of DNA testing. In addition to that, I also work on my own cases, so where I'm assigned cases by my manager, and I do the interpretation of DNA testing on those cases and review the cases of other people and what they've worked on.
And how long have you been employed at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab?
I've been there approximately 10 years.
Do you have any specialized training to be a DNA analyst?
When I first began at the DNA unit 10 years ago, I went through an 8-month-long training program where I learned about the theoretical discipline of forensic DNA testing, as well as the practical application of it. I tested mock evidence samples in the laboratory to determine what those DNA profiles were and learned about how to do that testing. Additionally, since that training, every year we go through continuing education where we learn about new methodologies that we're adopting in the laboratory and also any kind of changes that are happening in the field of forensic DNA analysis.
So you said that you've had testing, is that correct?
I'm sorry.
Have you had testing?
Yes.
And what kind of testing have you had?
So every time there's a new technology adopted or there's new training that I go through, at the end of that training, we do a competency test where we are tested on if we have understood that methodology by taking a written exam or oral exam as well as a practical exam in the laboratory. In addition to that, twice a year, we go through proficiency testing.
So have you passed the competency testing that you've taken?
Yes, I have.
And you said that twice a year you have proficiency testing. Who monitors that or provides that proficiency testing?
So the proficiency test samples are provided by an external agency, and those samples are tested in our laboratory as we would process any casework samples as well. And then the answers for those items of evidence, the DNA profiles we obtained, are submitted back to that external agency who will then grade us to ensure that we obtain the correct DNA profiles.
And have you passed that proficiency testing?
Yes, I've passed all the ones I've taken over the 10 years.
Thank you. Are you familiar with lab case 23-00596?
Yes, I am.
And what type of DNA testing was conducted in this case?
In this case, we conducted a type of testing known as stRDNA testing, which follows a 4-step process in the laboratory, at the end of which we obtain a DNA profile.
Okay. So just generally, can you discuss that 4-step process?
Generally, that 4-step process starts with extraction in the first step, where we break open the cells in which the DNA is found. This is similar to like cracking open an egg where the DNA is found within the yolk of it, and we extract that DNA. We use heat and chemicals to do this. The second step is known as quantitation, where we determine how much DNA is present in that sample so that we can proceed with the next step. The next step is known as amplification. In that third step, we make millions and millions of copies of the DNA that is found there, targeting certain locations within the DNA. In this case, we target 26 locations that are found throughout the chromosome, as well as a sex-determining locus as well. And then the last step is capillary electrophoresis, During that step, we analyze those copies of DNA to generate a DNA profile, which can then be interpreted for comparison purposes.
And then once the raw data is generated, you said that you're able to make some comparison here?
Yes.
And how is that done, generally?
So generally, the first thing we would do is interpret the DNA profile, which means that we would observe that DNA profile to see what is in that DNA profile. So what are the different characteristics of the DNA that we're observing at these 26 locations that we have tested? We will determine how many individuals are in this mixture, so the number of people that make up this DNA profile. Is it coming from one person or multiple individuals? And then that profile, once we've determined what it is, we can compare it to a known standard or somebody whose DNA profile we know to see if they would be included in that sample or excluded from it.
And in this case, 23-00596, there were many items that were tested by multiple people in the lab for DNA testing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And all of those people did the four-step process. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was your role here?
At the end of that four-step process, data is generated on a computer. At the end of that process, my role comes in at that point where I look at that data. So it comes off in a form that we have to interpret using a software program. So that's where my role starts, where I interpret that data.
So I'm now going to start to ask you about what you did here and about each individual piece of data that you looked at with each individual item that you looked at. Is that okay?
That's okay.
So let's start with the first round of testing and the first items that you looked at. I want to ask you about item 9-27.2.1. What is that item, ma'am?
Do you mind if I look at my notes?
You may look at your notes.
Thank you. That is a sample of an interior of dark gray slippers found in bag number 4 at 300 Forest Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
This DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture of 3 contributors, including male DNA.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
Yes. The DNA profile from this item is at least 270 million times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe and 2 unknown individuals than if it originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals. This provides support for an inclusion of Anna Walshe to this profile.
So what does that mean?
So the statistic we report is known as a likelihood ratio. The first part of this is determining what the DNA profile is. In this case, the DNA profile is a mixture of 3 contributors, meaning that the profile that was observed on this item came from 3 individuals. In this profile, when we do a comparison, we compare the characteristics at each of these 26 locations to see if the profile that is Anna Walshe's profile matches those or is consistent with the ones that are observed in the DNA profile. And through the statistical analysis, what we learned is that it is at least 270 million times more likely to observe this DNA profile if it originated from Anna Walshe than if it did not, and 2 other individuals than if it originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals. The likelihood ratio is a statistical calculation that shows us how likely it is to observe a DNA profile given two propositions. One, that the person would be included in the DNA profile, or the other, that the person is excluded or not included in the DNA profile. And the value of that likelihood ratio can tell us which of these propositions is more likely to observe this DNA profile given either of these propositions.
So how do you calculate the likelihood ratio?
That is calculated using a software known as STRmix or StarMix. And in that software, we use calculations that we derive from the general population of how common or rare certain characteristics are at these 26 locations observed. And we use that in the general population in the U.S., and we use that information to calculate the likelihood ratio.
Can you explain when you said this was a mixture of 3 contributors?
So that just means that the DNA profile that we observed at these 26 locations, what I observed is that I would see DNA from multiple people, in this case, 3 individuals. We receive half our DNA from our mother and half from our father. So we would expect to see for a single source profile or something coming from one person would either have one characteristic or 2 characteristics at each of these locations. In some of these locations, I saw 5 or 6 characteristics, which means that there's at least 3 people here in this mixture.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Yes. The DNA profile from this item is at least 12 quintillion times more likely if it originated from Brian Walshe and 2 unknown individuals than if it originated from 3 unknown unrelated individuals. And this provides support for an inclusion.
What is a quintillion?
Quintillion is 1 followed by 18 zeros.
Can you tell when the DNA was contributed?
I cannot, through the testing that we do, we cannot determine when or how the DNA was deposited on an evidence item.
Does DNA have to be contributed at the same time?
No, it does not.
Moving to item 9-27.3.1, can you tell me what that item is?
That was a sample from stain A on the exterior top left of the gray slipper, bag number 4 at 300 Forest Street.
And can you tell me what's the DNA profile result for this item?
This DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture of 2 contributors, including male DNA.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
Yes. The DNA profile from this item is at least 16 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe and an unknown individual than if it originated from 2 unknown unrelated individuals, and this provides support for an inclusion of Anna Walshe to this profile.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 77 times more likely if it originated from Brian Walshe and an unknown individual than if it originated from 2 unknown unrelated individuals. This provides limited support for an inclusion. Our DNA unit validation studies have shown that there is an inclusion of non-contributors in this likelihood ratio range of about 2 to 1,000. And adventitious support could be attributed to this conclusion.
So what does that mean?
So when we do these calculations for the likelihood ratio, we're relying on the DNA profile that we observed in that evidence item. The more data we have there, that means the more of these 26 locations where we observe this DNA profile, the higher the statistic will be for an inclusion. And that's because there's more support and more data observed. When there is limited support for an inclusion, it means that the data for that contributor in that mixture, so it doesn't mean everyone in that mixture had less DNA, just that one or more contributors had less DNA available there for comparison, so the statistic is lower because of it. In our validation studies, what we did see, because all humans do share some DNA with each other, that we would see some non-contributors, meaning that people who really shouldn't we made mixtures where we knew who was in those mixtures. And so we would have some non-contributors get a likelihood ratio that's inclusionary, show that they're included when they really shouldn't be included. And it's because they happen to have some alleles that are common with what was observed in the DNA profile. So in this case, for the statistic, even though there is support for an inclusion, that support is limited, meaning that there is less data available.
What is an anillion?
A nonillion is 1 followed by 30 zeros.
What type of cells is DNA found in?
It is found in all kinds of biological cells that we have, such as our blood cells, which are our white blood cells, our hair cells, skin cells, saliva, anything we could have in our body that has a nucleus. Any cell that has a nucleus would have DNA in it.
And what of those is potentially found in a shoe?
From a shoe, it could be if there's a biological process that's deposited on there, that biological fluid could contribute DNA, or more typically for clothing and shoes, it would be from skin cells that are from wearing that shoe multiple times.
Do your results tell you what type of cells these came from?
No, they do not.
And do the individuals have to contribute the same type of cells?
No, they do not. One of the things that could cause a mixture of DNA profiles is if there's different types of cells from different individuals that are contributing to the same evidence item.
What is item 9-32.1.1?
That is a sample of an interior sleeve cuff of a Tyvek suit that was found in bag number 6 at 300 Forest Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
The DNA profile for this item was interpreted as a mixture of 3 contributors, including male DNA.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 4.8 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe and 2 unknown individuals than if it originated from 3 unknown unrelated individuals, and this provides support for an inclusion.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Yes, the DNA profile from this item is at least 100 trillion times more likely if it originated from Brian Walshe and 2 unknown individuals than if it originated from 3 unknown unrelated individuals, and this provides support for an inclusion.
So when you say things like this provides support for an inclusion, is that standard language that you're using?
Yes.
And standard language for whom?
The standard language for forensic DNA analysis in general, and then at our laboratory, we've adopted this language as part of it. Many laboratories would use very similar language.
What is item 9-32.2.1?
Sample from stain A of the exterior left pant leg of the Tyvek suit from bag number 6 at 300 Forest Street.
And is this the same Tyvek suit that we just discussed previously in 9-32.1.1?
Yes.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
For this item, there was the DNA profile was a female DNA profile originating from a single contributor.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
Yes, the DNA profile is at least 30 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual, and this provides support for an inclusion.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this single source female DNA profile.
What does that mean?
So the single source DNA profile is probably the easiest ones for us to do a comparison because we should be able to see if the single source profile we have from the evidence matches the one profile we have from our known standard or the reference we have. So when I say somebody's excluded, it means that the 2 profiles don't match each other.
What is item 9-32.5.1?
And that is a sample from stain D on the interior right sleeve of the Tyvek suit.
And is this the same Tyvek suit as discussed with items 3 and 4 that we previously discussed?
Yes.
But is this a different stain?
Yes.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
The DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture of 2 contributors, including male DNA.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 110 sextillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe and an unknown individual than if it originated from 2 unknown unrelated individuals, and this provides support for an inclusion.
And what is sextillion?
A sextillion is 1 followed by 21 zeros.
I'm sorry,
21 zeros.
thank you. Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Yes, the DNA profile from this item is estimated to be 6 times more likely if it originated from 2 unrelated individuals than if it originated from Brian Walshe and an unknown individual. This provides limited support for an exclusion. Similar to before, the MSPCL DNA unit validation studies have shown that exclusions for the inverse likelihood ratio range of 2 to 1,000 have shown known contributors could be excluded, and adventitious support could be attributed to this conclusion.
So what is limited support for exclusion?
So it's very similar to the inclusion one I described in our validation studies. We also looked at profiles where since we knew who those mixtures were made of, those individuals, we would compare this to those individuals. And when there's limited data available, again, for comparison for one or more of the contributors in a mixture profile, the statistic would be lower, but it's on the exclusion side. And when it is a lower statistic on the exclusion side, we would like to report it as a number, just so we can be clear that there's a possibility that somebody who is truly meant to be in this mixture would be actually excluded from it because of there being limited data for support. So in this case, there is support for an exclusion, but there is only 6 times more likely for that support. The likelihood ratio, it's in that range of 2 to 1,000 again.
What is item 16-13.1?
This was an unknown tissue that recovered from the Swampscott dumpster.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
This was a female DNA profile originating from a single contributor.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 30 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual, and this provides support for an inclusion.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile.
So I want to move on now to the next round of DNA testing. What is item 5-1.1?
This is a sample from swabs of red-brown stain K on a basement floor in 516 Chief Justice Cushing Highway.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
This DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture of 2 contributors, including male DNA.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 15 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe and an unknown individual than if it originated from 2 unrelated individuals. And again, this provides support for inclusion of Anna Walshe to this DNA profile.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile.
What is item 7-10.3.1?
This was a sample of stained area C on the blade of a hacksaw, placard number 8, 300 Forest Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
For this item, a female DNA profile was obtained originating from a single contributor.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 30 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual, and this provides support for inclusion of Anna Walshe to this DNA profile.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile. What is item 7-10.4.1? That is a sample of the handle of the hacksaw, placard number 8 at 300 4th Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
The female DNA profile was obtained originating from a single contributor.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 30 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than from an unknown, unrelated individual, and this provides support that Anna Walshe is included in this DNA profile.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile.
What is item 9-22.1.1?
That is sample from stain A on a white towel number 1 with red-brown stains on it that was found in bag number 2 at 300 4th Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
There was a female DNA profile observed originating from a single contributor.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 30 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than from an unknown, unrelated individual. This provides support for inclusion of Anna Walshe to this DNA profile.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile.
What is item 9-28.1.1?
This was a sample of stained area A on apparent hairs found in bag number 4 at 300 4th Street.
What was the DNA profile result for this item?
There was a female DNA profile observed on this item originating from a single contributor.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile is at least 30 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. This provides support for inclusion of Anna Walshe to this DNA profile.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile.
What is item 9-31.1?
That is a sample from cutting of red-brown stain on a piece of rug from bag number 5 at 300 4th Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
There was a female DNA profile observed originating from a single contributor.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 30 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. This provides support for inclusion of Anna Walshe to this DNA profile.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile.
Moving on to the third round of DNA testing. What is item 7-13.1?
It is a sample from area A on the head of a hatchet, placard number 8 at 300 4th Street.
And what was the DNA profile result from this item?
There was a female DNA profile observed originating from a single contributor.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
The DNA profile from this item is at least 33 nonillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual, and this provides support for an inclusion of Anna Walshe to this DNA profile.
Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from this DNA profile.
What is item 7-13.2.1?
That is the sample from the handle of the hatchet, placard number 8 at 300 4th Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
The DNA profile from this item was interpreted as a mixture of two contributors. Due to limited information available, contributor 2 was deemed not suitable for comparison purposes.
So Were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
Yes, the DNA profile from this item is at least 2.6 octillion times more likely if it originated from Anna Walshe and an unknown individual than if it originated from two unrelated individuals, and this provides support for the inclusion of Anna Walshe to this profile.
And what does it mean, due to limited information, contributor 2 is not suitable for comparison?
It just means that in this mixture DNA profile, the data that is observed for one of these two contributors is so low level that we would not be able to make a comparison to any known reference standards. So we test 26 locations. We require in our DNA processing that data must be observed at a minimum of 3 locations for us to be able to do any comparisons to it. In this case, data was observed at less than 3 locations for this second contributor.
And what is an octillion?
An octillion is 1 followed by 27 zeros.
And you said that you were able to provide support for Anna Walshe, but were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
Brian Walshe is excluded from the first contributor that's suitable for comparison in this DNA profile.
So what does that mean?
So since it's a mixture of 2 contributors and I can only compare one of the 2, that one contributor, the DNA profile shows that it's the likelihood ratio shows support for inclusion of Anna Walshe to this profile, but Brian Walshe is excluded from that suitable for comparison first contributor in this profile.
What was item 9-20.1?
That was sample from stain A on tape with apparent gauze with red-brown stains on it, found in bag number 2 at 300 Forest Street.
And what was the DNA profile result for this item?
There was a male DNA profile obtained on this item originating from a single contributor.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Anna Walshe?
Anna Walshe was excluded from this DNA profile.
And were you able to come to a conclusion about the comparison to the known profile of Brian Walshe?
The DNA profile is at least 23 octillion times more likely if it originated from Brian Walshe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual, and this provides support that Brian Walshe is included as a contributor to this DNA profile.
And what is an octillion?
An octillion is 1 followed by 27 zeros.
I might have one moment, Your Honor.
Yes. Cross.
Good afternoon.
I think you said it in your in some of your answers in regards to the first round of testing that you testified to. And was that testing, was the report issued on January 13th of 2023?
Yes, that's correct.
And in the context of some of your answers to the testing results that you told this jury about, for instance, sample 9-27.2.1 at paragraph 1 on page 2. Mm-hmm. You indicate that it was interpreted as a mixture of 3 contributors.
That's correct.
Now, as you were explaining that and some of the other conclusions and the results of testing, you used the phrase at least 3 people, correct?
That's correct.
So when you write this report and you include the phrase, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture of 3 contributors, it's more accurate to say the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture of at least 3 contributors?
No, when we are doing our testing, we are using the information that we have in our profile. And in order to do any comparison analysis or further any kind of interpretation on it, we have to determine the number of contributors. So in this case, the data that I observed showed that there was 3 individuals in this. There could be more, but it's not in the data that I observed.
There could be more, though.
Yes, obviously the instrumentation we use, there could be contributors that are there that are not detected, but the ones that I observed, the profile showed a mixture of 3 contributors, which is how I interpreted this profile.
And when you interpret the number of mixtures, like you've just explained to the jury, am I right in saying that since we each inherit one allele from our father at a particular locus and one allele from our mother, then we typically have 2 different alleles at that one particular locus. Is that fair to say?
We could have 1 or 2 alleles at a locus, depends on if you inherit the same characteristic from both the mother and the father, or you inherit 2 different characteristics from the mother and the father.
And when you inherit the same allele, your father gives you the same allele as your mother, that would be a homozygote. That would be another way to frame that.
That's correct. That's a scientific term for that.
As opposed to 2 different alleles, your mother gave you one allele, your father gave you a different allele, then you'd be considered a heterozygote at that locus.
That's correct.
So what you're doing is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what you're doing is you're looking at all the alleles that you have in front of you on a particular sample, and you're trying to determine how many, and once again, correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to determine how many peaks you have at a particular locus. And for instance, if you had, 2 heterozygotes combined in a 2-part mixture, you would probably expect to see 4 different alleles there?
If we were looking at a mixture of 2 contributors, we would expect to see up 3 or 4 characteristics at the location. When we are looking at the DNA profile, he mentioned the word peaks. They kind of look like an EKG. If you can imagine like peaks and valleys on an EKG, that's what our data looks like. And so when we're looking at that, we are trying to just not only look at how many of those peaks are present, but what the level of each of those peaks is, because that can also tell us if it's coming from different individuals. So you would expect that if the same individual is contributing DNA to it at all of these 26 locations, they would contribute similar amounts of DNA at all the 26 locations. And so if we see some high peaks in one location and low peaks in a different one, that could also tell us that there is a mixture present as well. So not only looking at the number of peaks that are present, but also the level of these peaks.
And so there are some assumptions being made about the way you interpret the data.
The assumptions we're making is based in science that we inherit half our DNA from our mother and half from our DNA, half our DNA from our father. So we expect to see 1 or 2 alleles or peaks at each of these locations. So we're using that information to then assess the profile to see how many contributors are in this profile.
And without complicating this too much, and I don't intend to do that, but there is observed in DNA testing data, not just at a particular allele, 1 allele if it's a homozygote or 2 alleles if it's a heterozygote, but there's actually times when there's a triallelic allele, all right?
That's correct.
And so that's all I meant about the assumptions. And I understand they're scientifically based, but there are assumptions being made, correct?
Right. So if there is something like a triallelic pattern, there is a pattern to them, and we do know what those patterns look like. And what triallelic is that during the cell formation that happens, there's a mutation that occurs in the DNA that causes an extra copy to be present, either of either the allele from your mother, or the allele from your father, or a form of that allele. And that would cause, instead of seeing 1 or 2 peaks, we would see 3 peaks present for that person. But those usually have a pattern to them, and we can look at that, especially in single source profiles, and determine determine that. I did not observe any such things in the profiles that I saw in this testing that we did.
It's very clear, isn't it, that you have, in a lot of these samples, if not most of these samples, you have concluded that a profile that was associated with Anna Walshe from a known sample, you could see the same profile in many of these samples, correct?
For any of the ones that were single source contributors, meaning there's only one person, that's where I can make that exact matching from the reference.
And then the ones that are mixtures?
The ones that are mixtures, those we would have to compare the whole profile as a whole. So it wouldn't always just be a matching of the two different peaks that we see. It would be a matching of looking at that plus the information we have on the levels of that contribution to see how likely it is to observe that profile if they were included in this mixture versus not included in this mixture.
Thank you. We appreciate your very clear answers. And what I would like to ask you now is something that you said early on direct examination. Your DNA testing and your results that you're reporting to this jury, it does not inform you of how a particular biological substance or a nuclear cell that resulted in the DNA profile, how it was deposited on that particular object that appears here in the reports, correct?
That's correct. We cannot determine how the DNA was deposited.
And if I were to tell you and suggest to you that for many of these items that were tested, if they were found combined with other items in a bag, and those other items came into contact with each other, you would agree with me that you can't tell this jury if the biological substance that was tested on one object might not have been transferred simply from another object that it came into contact with in that bag, correct?
Overruled.
That's correct. It could be transferred from one item to another item in a bag.
And would that transfer, that word you just used, would that transfer also occur if two items or more were placed in a single bag and then that bag was actually compressed by a compactor that compressed that bag very tightly to reduce its size? Would it be even more likely that there would be a, quote, transfer between those two objects of biological material?
Objection to the hypotheticals?
Rephrase your question.
Would transfer be more likely if two or more objects were placed in a bag, placed after that into a compactor, and compressed together where the items within that bag were compressed together?
Objection. Same question.
Same result.
If two items come into contact with each other, there's a possibility of transfer of biological material on those two items, correct?
That's correct.
And does the possibility of transfer between two items, would it increase if those items are pressed together tightly for a period of time?
I'm not sure if the chances would increase or decrease if they're pressed together, but if two items were to come in contact with each other, there would be a likely transfer of DNA.
So, based on all of your based on all of your observations of the data and the results here, once again, you can't say how any of the biological material was deposited on any of these items, correct?
That's correct.
And you cannot tell the jury, and it's the limitation of the DNA testing, you can't tell when it was deposited, correct?
That's correct.
And for instance, if there is a particular object like a tool, let's say a hatchet, you cannot tell from your DNA testing if that hatchet actually ever came into contact with the biological material.
Objection.
I didn't finish, but maybe I'll start over again. Let me start over again. the DNA testing on a particular object does not tell you that that object was ever used against a person whose DNA profile appears on that object.
Objection.
Sustained.
Well, you have told us that the biological substance that was tested does not tell you anything about how that biological substance got on that item, correct?
That's correct. The DNA testing that we do cannot tell us how or when the DNA was deposited on an item.
And I think you told us this on direct, but I just want to make sure I understood it completely. The DNA testing that you conducted here on the biological samples, that can result, the DNA profile can result from any nucleated cell, correct?
That's correct.
And so we heard you refer to skin cells, correct?
That's correct.
And we heard you refer to blood cells, correct?
Yes, except for red blood cells, all other types of blood cells do have nucleuses.
Okay. And so when you are given samples to test, you do not determine in your laboratory, and you can't determine based on your DNA results, whether your DNA results are the result of a profile coming from a skin cell or a blood cell or some other nucleated cell, correct?
That's correct. We would not be able to determine the cell type from which that DNA profile was obtained.
And even though sometimes you might get a sample that's identified as a red-brown stain on an item, especially an item of clothing, even if you got a full profile from that particular stain, you still don't know if the profile you got came from epithelial cells or skin cells versus blood cells, correct?
That's correct. We would not know if it came from any blood cells that were present on that item or skin cells that might have been present on that item as well.
And on sample 7-13.2.1, I think that's the sample that you explained to the jury that it was a mixture of two contributors, correct?
That's correct.
And even though you concluded that it was a mixture of two contributors, you said that due to the limited information, the contributor two, and you put in, you actually referred to it as contributors, and you put the S at the end of contributor in parentheses, contributors, two is not suitable for comparison, correct?
So a contributor is just, it's just one contributor. Contributor two is not suitable. The reason there's a parentheses S there is because we use similar conclusions when we have multiple contributors that may not be suitable for comparison. The wording that we use, like I said, it's from our protocols that is designed to sort of kind of cover all different types of DNA profiles that we can see. So in similar conclusions can be written where we would say contributors 2 and 3 would not be suitable for comparison, which is why there is a parentheses S there. In this case, the only contributor that I'm talking about that is not suitable for comparison is contributor 2.
That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Redirect.
Nothing, thank you.
You may step down.